American commercial space station companies are becoming increasingly international, and this is intentional. And I believe it's only going to increase as these commercial space stations develop further, become operational, and really seek further users and partners. We've had lots of space station news come out over the past couple of weeks. Two pieces of news yesterday. First off, congratulations to my colleagues at Gravitics that won a contract to supply Axiom Space with what they're calling spacecraft, which that term actually gave me pause at first, because when we think of spacecraft, we think of a vehicle that transports. I suppose you can look at space stations as a transporting, it's a moving, it's orbiting, right? And so Gravitics, they're building a pressurized module for Axiom Space. Axiom is one of the 3 commercial space stations being funded by NASA. You might hear the term commercial LEO destination. And Axiom is arguably further ahead than the others because they were chosen first. They will attach to the International Space Station before the ISS was retired. 1, 2, or 3 modules of Axiom Station will attach on and then detach from ISS prior to the ISS being deorbited by SpaceX in the 2030 timeframe. Now, Axiom Space wants to be operational with its modules attached to ISS before 2030. The timelines for these things always slip, so I find that less important. What's more important is that we don't have a gap between the ISS retiring and commercial space stations coming on board. Going back to the Gravitics contract, they are being paid $125 million by Axiom to build a 4-meter, or for my fellow Americans, that's a 13-foot diameter spacecraft, they call it, but again, it's a space module, a space station module. It will be pressurized, and I guess what makes it a spacecraft is it will have its own power and propulsion system. It will have its own transportation capability. Gravitics has been doing hardware testing for a while, for a few years now. They plan to fly some components to the International Space Station later this year for testing, and then get that module to Axiom 2026 timeframe. Again, all these things usually slip. Axiom has already been contracted for a few years now with Taslania Space in Italy for its initial 3 modules. These international partnerships are crucial because there was a question that I posed. I asked myself, when the International Space Station retires and the whole concept of NASA funding commercial space stations and being an anchor tenant for these commercial space stations, that would make it very American-centric. And how is it going to work then to partner with governments around the world when there's no intergovernmental agreements between, ESA or JAXA or any other country that is a partner with ISS? There won't be those kinds of intergovernmental agreements with a commercial space station. So it makes perfect sense that these commercial space stations are trying to go international. All of them are based in the United States, but all of them, I believe, have some kind of international partnership to one degree or another. And all of them are going to be seeking government contracts with non-US governments as well as US governments and additional international users, whether that is a permanent user, another anchor tenant, or whether that is a temporary user or a passenger. Why limit your customer base to just the United States when these kinds of commercial space stations, they are very expensive and unproven in terms of their profitability? This is a nascent industry, completely brand new. There has never been a commercial space station except for Mir, which was bought by Mir Corp, which was a commercial company, but that was only for a very short period of time. And Mir was originally, of course, built by the Russian government. The other piece of news that came out yesterday was from Japan. Mitsui & Co., and that's a giant company in Japan, they created a brand new subsidiary called Japan Leo Satchu. And this subsidiary is going to be building a Japanese module. Not a Japanese module for the ISS that already exists, not a Japanese module for any particular commercial space station, but in general, a Japanese module that will be based on technology already developed for the HTV. The HTV is a cargo resupply spacecraft that has been operational for a while now. It doesn't fly very frequently. There's a new version that's hopefully going to start flying next year. The technology is well understood and developed, and they're going to take that technology from the HTV, that transfer vehicle, and they are going to turn that into a Japanese space station module. And they have not really given any other details about how big this will be or what's going to be on it. And they have not said who they're partnering with. Mitsui has partnered or invested with Axiom Space. So it could be that they intend to pursue attaching a Japanese module to Axiom Station, but that has not been announced. That's not formalized. It could be that they're not looking to do just one module for one space station. Maybe they want to do Axiom plus another space station. Gravitics emphasized that, by the way. Gravitics said that we don't want to just partner with Axiom. We are open to partnering with any commercial space station. It could be that Japan Leo Shachu, tell me if I'm pronouncing that wrong, by the way, is the same way. We won't know until they give us a little bit more information. Why is this important? Because not only is this subsidiary of a very large company, but they also have ties, of course, to the Japanese government. The Japanese government, JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency, is going to be losing its modules when the ISS retires. So who is JAXA going to be working with? Well, they could work with any of the commercial space stations, but they'd probably prefer to work with a commercial space station already working with a Japanese company, already perhaps attaching a Japanese module. And this is not necessarily new. So we've already seen partnerships being established with the European Space Agency, ESA, with Axiom Space, and with Starlab. Starlab was originally formed as a partnership between NanoRacks and Voyager Space being the parent company of NanoRacks. Now that name NanoRacks has gone away, so it's just Voyager. And Starlab LLC was formed as an independent company, which is a partnership with Voyager Space and Airbus. So already Starlab is really tying itself to that European market by bringing in a major European company as a partner. Axiom Space doing something similar. They've already been working with ESA and other European governments to fly Europeans on its Axiom missions to the ISS. I can see that kind of partnership continue, where they continue to fly Europeans and other non-Americans on Axiom Station, but also have that partnership with the infrastructure and the user base of Axiom Station. Orbital Reef, which is that partnership between Blue Origin and Sierra Space and a few others, they've been a bit quieter about their partnerships. They haven't really said much since they were established, but we do know that Sierra Space had a partnership established with Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. So assuming that the partnership between Blue Origin and Sierra Space is going forward, there was rumors earlier that was breaking apart, but they haven't broken apart. So that partnership is still intact. And assuming Sierra Space is still working with Mitsubishi, maybe we will also see that Japanese tie-in with Orbital Reef. But again, that's not announced, that's not formal. I'm very curious to see what Orbital Reef is doing behind the scenes. And this is all very interesting to me because I have a background in getting users and customers for space stations. Like, this is something I have experienced doing. So I'm ever so curious to know what all these different players are doing. There's other commercial space stations in the works. There's, for example, VAST, which wants to launch Haven 1. And as far as I can tell, it's a much smaller space station, and they only have one international partnership that I found, and it's with a Singapore company called Add Value. I don't know what they're planning in terms of Haven 1 or any future larger space station in terms of international partnerships. So again, super curious to see where this all goes. One more international space station partnership I want to talk about is with India, ISRO. India's been working for years now on developing its capability to launch its own astronauts. And at the same time, they want to develop an Indian space station. And most recently, they've developed more and more of a partnership with NASA. They signed the Artemis Accords, for example, and they have an agreement now to fly a cargo resupply mission to the International Space Station, assuming that all the partners are on board with that, because the ISS isn't just NASA, there are other partners. They want to accomplish that by the end of the decade, which makes sense because the ISS is due to be retired and deorbited by 2030-ish. And they also want to start launching the first module of their Indian space station by the end of the decade. That has been slipping for a while. I don't know if that's going to slip into the 2030s. We'll just have to see. But they've got plans and they're moving forward, partnering with NASA. By the way, this information comes from the director of ISRO's Human Spaceflight Center, Mr. Mohan, who spoke at the Indian Space Conference at the end of June. One last thing I want to talk about, which goes into the realm of probably not going to happen. The head of the Russian space agency, Roscosmos, Yuri Borisov, he said about a week ago, he's hoping to have a 4-module Russian space station operational by 2030. Anyone who's been following the Russian space program and its great difficulties and its mishaps with the International Space Station over the past few years can tell you that this is in the realm of delusion and fantasy and not reality. However, despite sanctions, despite budget cuts, despite not paying their people very well at all, and the bribes and all the other corruption that goes on in Russia, they might actually be funneling more money into this for national prestige reasons to put up at least one module maybe by 2030, or at least start work on a Russian space station. I'm still super skeptical. They're certainly not going to have an operational space station by 2030, because when ISS is deorbited, they will have nothing unless they start working on something, because they have not signed on with the Gateway, the International Space Station partnership that's going to be around the moon. And I don't foresee that happening. They are not formal participants with the Tiangong space station, that's China's space station. China says that they want to open it up to international agreements, but Russia, I don't believe, has been specifically mentioned as a partner. So what will Russia have? Russia has this long history, decades of history in space with various space stations and human spaceflight. What will they have after ISS is retired? Which is why I think that Russia might actually start putting money into a Russian space station program. It will not happen quickly. It will have lots of delays and problems, but they might actually do something by the time ISS is retired. We'll just have to see. In contrast to the American space stations, these private space stations that are seeking to expand and gain international partnerships, I see the Russian space station as much more secluded and isolationist. I don't believe that they're going to have very many partners at all. They might have some very small partnerships, just like back in the day during the Soviet Union, there were partnerships with Soviet allied countries and Soviet bloc countries. They could go back to that kind of trend, but they need to have an operational space station to do that. Otherwise, it's just a paper project, and Russia is left in the dirt in terms of its space progress.